He was covered in blood, but it was the silence in his eyes that cut me the deepest, because in that moment, I understood that this was no ordinary soldier. This was someone the whole world wanted dead, except me. During the war, there was an unwritten rule between us. Every wounded person who walked through those doors, regardless of their uniform, their flag, or their silence, deserved to be treated. But some silences don't bleed outward, and his seemed denser than the smell of ether in the air. I was young, but I already knew when a presence carried more than the pain itself. And he, that man, carried a weight no scalpel could reach. No one told me who he was. But then, no one needed to. There was a tension in the way he huddled on the stretcher, an awkward attempt to disappear even when everything about him was already exposed. His fractured arm, his ripped abdomen, his dry eyes. He didn't beg for help, and maybe that's what made me stay. Some names are repeated until they become statues. Others are forgotten so quickly they vanish even from the walls of the trenches. And then, there are those who never had a name, nor a record, who pass like a whisper amid the dust of the corridors, leaving behind a doubt that can last a lifetime. I remember the first time I laid hands on him, not out of protocol, not out of duty, but on impulse. Something in him demanded silence, demanded shadow, demanded not to be seen, and I obeyed. Maybe you think helping someone like that was crazy, and maybe it was, because sometimes saving a stranger is the loneliest way to lose yourself. Even today, when I wake before light, I wonder if I did the right thing. But right, my dear, sometimes it's also a kind of lie we tell ourselves to keep breathing. I didn't know what he'd done. I just knew he was there, and that no one wanted him to leave that room alive. My name is John Marie Bellamy. I'm 84 years old and live alone in an old loft in Seattle, a place that was once a warehouse, then a bookstore, and today is just a haven for memories no one else seeks. My walls are made of dark wood, smell of book dust, and hold more silences than any diary could ever write. I live among tall bookshelves and windows covered with Japanese paper, where the light enters slowly, as if afraid of disturbing. I almost always wear the same black dress and fine wool scarf I was given when the war still cast a shadow over Europe. Sometimes I think I keep wearing them just to remind myself that I can still feel something in my chest. It was there, in the perpetual cold of occupied France, that I began tending to nameless wounded men in hospitals hidden beneath bakeries, ruined churches, and ancient wine cellars. I was nothing more than a young volunteer with steady hands and a constant fear of making too much noise. Every sigh could be a warning, every misplaced step a sentence. But what I did to that man, it wasn't impulse or courage. It was instinct. It was as if something inside me knew that if I didn't help him, something inside me would die too. So, if you're still here with me, listening to this, sit down, breathe, listen calmly, because this story has no proof or medals. It only has fragments. Slivers of memories that still cut inside. If you feel like some memories only live when they're told, then subscribe to the channel. This is a safe place. A space where even what was never said can finally rest. And sometimes, my dear, just listening is a way to save someone. It was called a hospital, but it was a mass of wooden beds, worn sheets, and broken promises. It was located in the back of a family home in Dijon, where the facade hid what the outside world couldn't see. The gate creaked as if hesitant with each new arrival, and the bricks supporting the interior walls had seen more prayers than a convent. There was no red cross on the door, no flags hung, and yet inside, lives were sewn together in haste, like someone trying to hold water with open hands. Stone stairs led to a damp basement where everything happened. It was always cold, even in August. The penicillin bottles and metal basins shared space with rats, rust, and shadows that never explained their origins. The ceiling was low, and we learned early to walk with our heads down. The sound of distant bombings echoed like dull thunder, and sometimes the silence between one explosion and the next hurt more. The interval where we didn't know who would be alive on the next stretcher. I was taken there by a distant cousin who could no longer work. She taught me quickly. Don't ask names, don't make promises, don't stare too long. It's the steady hand that survives, she'd say. And for a while that's what I tried to be. Just a steady hand. I washed wounds that smelled of exposed flesh, administered morphine when we had it, or pretended to when we had none. I learned to recognize the sound of death when it crept in, just by the way a body emptied its own air. Sometimes we held our breath together to see if time would pass unnoticed. Patients arrived in the early hours of the morning, brought by civilians with eyes too red to be just exhaustion. Many were wrapped in blankets like children. No one wanted to rock anymore. Some murmured names. Others screamed with fever. But most just lay there, inert, staring at the ceiling as if it were the sky. And each of those eyes, each of those trembling hands, was a piece in a puzzle that would never be put together. The ward commander was a woman named Agatha. She was in her 50s, with a face sculpted by tragedy, and a walk that seemed to carry 100 years on her shoulders. She said the hospital was invisible, because the world only saw what it wanted to see. And no one wants to see people dying in the basement of a bakery. She kept a list of the wounded in a blue notebook, with false names, altered dates, and coded notes. The list was our Bible. If you weren't on it, you didn't exist. And it was in this setting, amid gases and ash, that it all began. It was on a night too gray to forget, when a car without headlights pulled up behind the house. 3 short knocks on the side door, a warning, and then he entered. Not with his feet, but with his absence. He didn't seem injured like the others. He seemed absent, as if his body had arrived before his soul. 2 nuns carried him in their arms, and neither of them spoke. I saw blood on his clothes, yes, but I saw something else. I saw guilt, fear, and an emptiness that couldn't be contained in his skin. Agatha looked at him and, for a second, hesitated. Something I'd never seen before. The list opened. She searched line by line. Nothing. That man wasn't on the list. The nuns looked at each other. One of them simply whispered, "He fell, that's all." But her just hurt. It hurt because it carried something we never dared ask about. He wasn't wearing a uniform. He didn't have an identification tag. And yet, in his eyes, he carried the weight of someone who had already killed. Or perhaps worse, of someone who had let someone die. Agatha slammed the blue notebook shut. She turned around, and no one moved. The silence was so thick I could hear my own heart, and it was pounding as if it knew something was about to break. It was then that I looked at him, lying there, breathing slowly, and something inside me decided before I could think. I knelt down and touched the wound on his ribs with my iodine-stained fingers. He wasn't on the list, but he was there, and I, without understanding why, knew I couldn't let him die. The first thing I noticed about him wasn't the blood, nor the wound in his side. It was the way he stared at the ceiling, not like someone searching for hope, but like someone who's already said goodbye to the world and just waits for the light to go out for good. Those eyes, gray, almost colorless, didn't move even with the flickering lanterns, even with the cold cutting through the dawn, as if the pain no longer had room inside, or maybe as if he didn't think he deserved to feel pain at all. We placed him in the last bed in the hallway, near the boiler, a place where the steam made the walls sweat and muffled the loudest moans. It was where those without names and without hope were kept. He fit in there as if he already knew. He didn't ask questions. He didn't ask for anything. He just lay down. Or rather, he passed out. I tried to find something in his pockets, a letter, a token, a photograph. Nothing. His clothes were too dirty to tell where they came from. They weren't those of a soldier, nor a civilian. It was as if he'd shed his skin before arriving. And his body... Oh, his body said more than any document. His wrists showed old rope marks. His neck had deep, healing scratches. His chest, thin and bruised, looked like someone who'd been running for days, but without knowing where. As I cared for him, I noticed something strange. He wasn't shaking. Everyone shakes when they're cold, scared, or have a fever. But not him. He stood there, motionless, as if he didn't want to take up space, as if he were trying to disappear even from his own body. And that, to me, was more terrifying than any open wound. One of the nuns returned with a small vial. She didn't say where it came from, but she looked at me as if asking me to keep it a secret. She placed the vial beside the bed and left without a word. It was morphine, pure, strong, used only in the most desperate cases. That chilled me, because it meant that, to them, he might not be someone to be saved. He was someone to be soothed, someone who shouldn't wake up. But I couldn't. I couldn't administer the full dose. I gave him just enough to sleep. A dreamless, delirious sleep. And even then, he woke up earlier than expected. Hours later, he opened his eyes and looked at me for the first time. He didn't say anything. He just looked. And in that look, something inside me trembled. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't gratitude. It was a warning. A silent whisper that said, "I know you know." I sat there, hands in my lap, unsure of what to say to that look I didn't ask. And even without saying a word, he forced me to choose. Follow the list, or listen to what no list could contain. And it was that morning that I started lying. I lied on the record. I lied on the shift schedule. I even lied to myself, because by hiding who he was, I was also hiding a part of me that still believed in what was right. And from that moment on, he was no longer just a nameless wounded man. He was a secret with a face. In the invisible hospital, we learned early on to swallow judgment. It wasn't our job to decide who deserved to live, only to keep alive those who arrived with blood on their sheets and dull eyes. But with him, it was different. It only took one night for the murmurs to begin. One of the attendants, Claudine, refused to change his dressings. She said his flesh smelled different. And she wasn't lying. There was a strange odor, not of pus or necrosis, but something deeper, as if his body carried the memory of places where guilt lodged in the bones. 2 nurses requested a transfer upstairs. A nun stopped talking to me, and even Agathe, who never backed down, began avoiding the ward where he was. They didn't say it outright, but I knew. There was something about that man that frightened me more than the German gunfire or the screeching of night planes. It was the silence, his and ours. A silence that grew, spreading among the stretches, until it contaminated what faith remained in that place. I kept wondering, were they right? Was he really what they said? A traitor? A deserter? A man who escaped, leaving others to die? Or something worse? There were stories, whispers in the hallways, that a member of the resistance had been betrayed days before, tortured, executed, and that the informant had fled with a bullet in his stomach and fear in his heart. That description too much matched the dull-eyed man in the corner bed. But every time I tried to convince myself to leave him, something pulled me back. Maybe it was the way he endured the pain in silence, or the way his breathing slowed when I got close, as if my mere touch offered shelter. He never asked for anything. Never. And that very thing, made me want to stay. One day I found a basin of dirty cloths beside his bed. No one had changed the gauze. The infection was spreading beneath the stitches. He was alone, abandoned like an unwanted rag. And that's when I realized it wasn't just rejection. It was a collective, silent decision to let him die. No poison, no shooting, just failing to look, failing to care. As if by ignoring him, the world could right a wrong no one dared to name. That night I sat beside him with a warm towel and began cleaning his wounds, one by one, calmly, ashamed, angry, maybe not at him, but at myself for not knowing if this was redemption or cowardice. He looked at me again, and for the first time he spoke, a single word, low, dry. Thank you. I should have felt relief, but what I felt was fear, because now he was real. On that gray afternoon, the sky seemed closer to the basement ceiling than to the clouds. The light from the lamp hanging above his bed wavered, as if it too wavered. I was alone in the ward, and not by chance. The others had left, officially to distribute supplies. But I knew. It was their way of not being there when he finally died. But he didn't die. The fever receded, his breathing steadied, and with that came a decision. Either I entered the wound, or it would swallow him back up. The previous stitches had been poorly done, quick, messy, like mending a bag with a hole in it. I needed to open it up, wash the inside, sew it up slowly. It was the kind of procedure we only performed on people who had a chance. And in that moment, something in me needed to believe he still had it. I washed my hands with the charcoal soap that scraped my skin. I gathered the threads, the needle, the alcohol, and the cleanest cloth I could find. And I took a deep breath. He wasn't sleeping. He stared straight ahead, as if the ceiling were a courtroom. When I touched his skin, he didn't move, but his eyes blinked, just once, as if to say, "Go. Do what you have to do." The incision wasn't just in his skin. It was in me too. Every inch of it revealed something to me. There was nothing mechanical about that body. It was a flesh-blood trauma. It was human, even though so many had dehumanized it. I pushed aside the necrotic tissue and saw where the infection had begun, and where it might end, if I didn't dig deep. And I did. I went in with the tweezers, gently removing the darkened edges. He gritted his teeth, but he didn't groan. Sweat trickled down his temples. It was a sweat that didn't demand relief. It was resignation. Halfway through the process, my hands started to shake, not because of the technique, but because I felt a wave of guilt that drowned me. Who was I, after all? A nurse? An accomplice? Or just a woman too old to pretend she still understood right from wrong? At the edge of the wound, I found a sliver of tissue stuck to it. A piece of cloth, dark, almost black. It didn't look like his clothes. It was thicker, like a uniform, but not like ours. I held it between the tweezers. I looked, and I kept it, without knowing why. Maybe because it was all that remained of some truth he would never tell. I sewed in silence, stitch by stitch, the sound of metal scraping against the needle, the sound of skin closing again. When I finished, I sat down. My hands were still bleeding, not from the wound, but from the strain. I looked at him, and he finally looked back. Pain had flushed his face, but his eyes were still dull. And then, in a whisper so low I could hardly believe I heard it, he murmured, "You should let me die." I stood there, unsure of what to say, because maybe he was right. Maybe if I were someone better, more just, more faithful to the cause, I would have left him. But I wasn't made only of oaths and banners. I was made of flesh, too. And there, between life and error, I had chosen to hold on to what could be saved, even if no one else wanted it. In that moment, I sewed his skin shut. But I also sewed shut the beginning of a secret that would never heal within me. It was 2 days after the surgery that the whispers arrived. They came before the news, before the articulated words, a curt greeting, a glance averted as I passed through the hallway, the muffled sound of conversations that ceased as soon as I crossed the threshold. It was as if the hospital wall had grown ears, and the voices, teeth. Agatha called me to the corner of the kitchen, where the smell of stale bread and vinegar mingled with the smoke from the boiler. She didn't say my name. She just tugged on my sleeve and handed me a folded piece of paper. "She arrived this morning with the supplies. Don't leave it in plain sight." And she returned to the stove, as if she hadn't said anything. I unfolded the paper with trembling hands. It was a yellowed sheet, handwritten in an almost military-style script. A resistance bulletin. A warning. Dangerous deserter on the run, accused of collaborating with the enemy. Last location, Dijon region. Wounded, armed, identity uncertain, possibly altered face, extremely dangerous. My skin froze, not because of what was written, but because of what wasn't. The report didn't name anyone. It didn't provide certainty. It provided just enough to make anyone afraid and angry feel empowered to kill. And that cruel ambiguity, was sharper than any scalpel I'd ever used. I took the paper to my room and hid it between the pages of a book no one read anymore. A faded cover novel, bought years before the war, where the heroine died at the end protecting someone she didn't know. I closed the book slowly, as if sealing a pact. I returned to the ward. He was asleep, or pretending to be. His face was less pale. The stitches were still firm. The fever was gone. But something in him had changed, as if he knew, as if the threat was closer than ever. His fingers were clenched. His body stiffened, a wounded animal that senses the hunter before the trail. And it wasn't long before 2 men arrived with Agatha that same night. One was a civilian, thin, with a dark jacket and questioning eyes. The other was a soldier, with a blue armband wrapped around his left arm. They said they were there to check the records. "Precaution," they said, but their words felt like a verdict. Agatha led them to the blue notebook. They leafed through it page by page, asking for dates, places, surnames. When they reached the lower wing where he was, the civilian raised an eyebrow. "And this one? No name? No date?" Agatha hesitated. I leaned closer, my heart in my throat, and I answered before she had to lie. "He's a local, a man from the village. He was crushed by debris during the retreat." The civilian stared at me for a few seconds too long, and then he smiled, a smile without a mouth, only eyes. "Of course. A civilian. They always are." They didn't go down to him. Not that day. But the message was clear. They were watching. And any slip would be enough. And maybe, that smile wasn't ironic. Maybe it was recognition. Maybe that man knew exactly who was down there, between the damp blankets and hastily folded sheets. And maybe he decided to leave him where he was. For now. That night I locked the ward door with an iron hook, not for fear that he would escape, but that the world would finally come to collect what I had been trying to hide. And while the hospital slept, I sat with a glass of still water in my hand, listening to his distant breathing, because it was the only thing that still told me he was alive, And with it, I was reminded, with every heartbeat, that I was going too far. That's where it really began. The point of no return. The moment I stopped being just a nurse and became an accomplice. It wasn't planned. No one gave me instructions. But no one stopped me either. And when the world decides to turn its face away, sometimes silence is the only push we need to fall. The morning after the two men's visit, I went to the records room. The key was where it always was, hanging by a string behind the bookshelf. No one cared about the files anymore. The files were hastily scribbled, names faked, dates changed. But that, flawed as it was still the only layer between someone existing or disappearing forever. I picked up the blue notebook, the same notebook where the days of my youth were also trapped, even without my name written on any page. I sat at the wooden table with my elbows pressed against the rough surface, and I wrote, letter by letter, a made-up name, Louis Marchand, a fictitious location, Saint-Laurent-sur-Saône, a changed entry date, 2 days earlier than the real one, diagnosis, chest trauma due to impact from collapsed structure, signed, JMB. As the pen scratched the paper, I felt as if I were drawing a cross over what remained of my righteousness. Because there, amid lies written in a firm handwriting, I was building a hiding place, not of bricks or walls, but of words, a shelter made of fiction, and each filled line was a door I closed behind me. I didn't stop there. I began adjusting his medication schedules, swapping out the vials for diluted liquids, hiding the vials of real morphine, recording fevers he didn't have, reporting developments that didn't occur. He was the only patient whose temperature I didn't actually take. I just said it, made it up. And so, day after day, he disappeared from the eyes of those who still watched. By the end of the 3rd week, it was as if he'd become a ghost. No one asked about him. No one cared. Agathe pretended to believe my updates. Maybe out of exhaustion. Maybe because, deep down, she too knew what that hospital had become. A place of visible wounded and protected ghosts. He understood, of course. He looked at me with a mixture of recognition and anguish. He didn't say much. Sometimes he wouldn't make a sound for hours. But when he did speak, it was always with heavy words. "It won't last," he said once. "They'll find out." And I responded with silence, because that was all I had to offer. I couldn't promise salvation. I could only offer time. There was a night when he woke up shivering, a high fever, his eyes wide open as if seeing things that weren't there. He began to babble in German, broken words with no clear meaning. And then, without warning, he said a name. Clara. Just once. Clara. I didn't know who it was. A woman. A daughter. A victim. The next day he didn't remember. Or he pretended not to remember. And I didn't insist. But I wrote the name down on the back of a piece of paper. I kept it in my purse. Like someone holding onto a spark, unsure whether it will heat up or set everything on fire. And while the city outside lay in ruins and dust, I remained inside, rebuilding a man from pieces that weren't even mine, stitching skin together, inventing records, and hoping day after day that the lie would be more resilient than fate. He didn't sleep, or, if he did, it was a broken, dense, unremitting sleep. He could spend hours with his eyes closed, but the tension in his muscles betrayed that wakefulness was always lurking. I watched him from afar, sometimes from the stairs, sometimes from the dark hallway, and I could see, by the rhythm of his breathing, by the fingers that moved almost imperceptibly, that he never completely surrendered to rest. As if even asleep, he waited for the sound of a boot on the floor, a door slam, the end. The curious thing is that, over the weeks, many of our patients would fall back asleep. Even if briefly, even under the weight of morphine, there were moments of surrender. But not him. It was as if he were at war, even in the dark. A battle no one else could see, but which consumed him from within. I started leaving a glass of water on my nightstand every night. I never failed, but he never touched it. He remained there, untouched, like a silent pact. Once I swapped the glass for a ceramic mug, thinking maybe it was the glass that bothered him. The next day, the mug was upside down, as if to say, "Don't try to comfort me." One night, while the others slept and the boiler hummed like an old heart, I went down just to see him. The lights were off, but he was sitting. His back was to me, thin, hunched, his shoulders thrust forward as if carrying centuries. He said nothing when I approached. He didn't turn around. He just said, in the quietest voice I'd ever heard, "You shouldn't have done that." I stood still, feeling the cold creep up through the soles of my feet. "Done what?" I asked, knowing full well the answer. He took his time, then replied, "Keep me here. Keep me alive." And that was it. He lay down slowly, as if his own weight were pulling him, and returned to the state of absence. Not asleep, not awake, just suspended. From that day on, I began to notice small gestures. He avoided prolonged eye contact. He turned his face away when I adjusted the sheets. When I handed him his medication, he held the bottle underneath, not touching my fingers. And more than once, I noticed him leaving the pills under his pillow, as if refusing to get better. It was a body in denial, a spirit in refusal. And the more I tried to care for it, the more it became a mirror. And what I saw there frightened me, because deep down, I understood. I had felt that way too. Like someone who didn't want to be saved. Like someone who, when receiving affection, felt ashamed. Like someone who no longer felt worthy of acceptance. And maybe that's why I stayed, not out of pity, but out of recognition. One morning I heard a noise coming from his ward. I ran. I found the sheet on the floor, and he was standing, leaning against the wall, staring blankly. I went over to him, touched his arm, and he looked at me as if he hadn't seen me. "I saw her," he murmured. "She was there, sitting." I asked, "Who, my dear?" He hesitated. "Clara." That word again. Clara. I couldn't ask any more. He collapsed back onto the bed, and I sat there, leaning against the cold wall, feeling the time slip away. Every day I saw him more whole physically, and more broken inside. And it consumed me, because healing the body of someone who carries the desire to disappear is like trying to hold smoke between your fingers. And yet, I kept trying. Because there was something about him, in that gray gaze, in that faded presence, that told me, "Don't let me go. Not yet." And maybe I wanted him to say it out loud. Maybe I needed to. But he didn't sleep, and I didn't dream either. It was while changing the bandages on his chest, on a morning when fog crept in even through the window wells, that I felt something strange beneath his torn shirt. A small hard lump, hidden deep in the side, sewn into the lining as if it didn't want to be found. My instincts made me stop. The first thing that came to me was fear. Fear that I'd found a shard of glass, a blade, something that could hurt. But when I pried the fabric apart with the scissors and pulled out what was inside, it wasn't that. It was an old brass medallion, stained with dried blood and dust. No chain. No shine, just the cold oval disc, weighing more than its size warranted. I opened it carefully, the hinge creaking as if it wouldn't budge. And inside, a worn sepia photograph, bent at the edges, a portrait of a woman. Young, her hair tied back with a scarf, her expression serious. Her eyes looked familiar even though I'd never seen them. And beside the image, engraved in the thin metal, Clara, 1939. My stomach lurched, not just because of the name, the same one he'd mumbled on feverish nights, but because of the way the medallion was hidden, sewn inside his clothes, like a secret buried within his own body, like something he wanted to keep close and hidden from everyone. I looked at him. He was asleep, or pretending to be, as always, his face pale, his lips split. I could return the medallion and pretend I'd never seen him. I could sew it back on and keep the lie we were all breathing intact. But my hands wouldn't obey. I gripped the medallion tightly, closed it, and put it in my apron pocket. Just for now, I thought. Just to understand. Just to, protect. That afternoon, I sat in the empty cafeteria with the object clasped between my palms, as if holding a still-beating heart. Who was Clara? His wife? His sister? A lover? Or something darker? Part of what he had done? Part of the reason he now hid behind gauze and silence? I thought about asking, about showing, but I couldn't. Because deep down, I feared the answer. I feared Clara was the reason he was running away. Or worse, the reason the world wanted him dead. And at that point, I was too trapped to bear one more truth. In the following days, he began to act differently. Quieter, which seemed impossible. More elusive, as if he sensed something in him had been touched. And perhaps it had. Perhaps he knew the locket was no longer with him. And yet, he said nothing. Not a gesture, not a look. He just accepted it. And that somehow hit me harder than if I had screamed. Because trusting, even knowing that you were being invaded, was also a form of surrender. That night I slept with the locket under my pillow. Not out of curiosity, but because I felt, in some inexplicable way, that the object now held a piece of me too. And that, even without knowing who Clara was. She already lived among us, like a silent ghost, like an answer that didn't want to be found. It was on a muggy afternoon, the kind where the air seems to contain more dust than oxygen, that he arrived. Tall, his posture too straight for a civilian, and yet he wasn't in uniform. A man with the air of someone who doesn't ask, he demands. He carried a folded manila envelope under his arm and small, rust-colored eyes that seemed to analyze before even blinking. He didn't say where he was from. He simply introduced himself as Lieutenant Doyle. But that title was out of place. His accent was clean, almost American. But the silence was that of someone who has learned to wait more than to ask. Agata wasn't expecting him. That was clear from the way her eyes widened and the way she adjusted the scarf around her neck. "Inspection officer?" she asked, trying to maintain control. He simply lifted the envelope and said, "We've received information that there's a man here who isn't listed in any medical report from the last shipment. I came to check." The sentence was said without anger, without haste, but with something even worse. Certainty. I stood frozen for a few seconds. I felt the blood drain from my hands. My apron was stained with dried iodine, and the medallion, still hidden in my inside pocket, seemed to burn like a living brand against my skin. Agata hesitated. She said there was no one off the list, that everyone was duly registered. But Doyle was already walking. He knew the way. As if he'd been there before, in another life, on another mission. He descended the stairs with the calm of someone treading ground already conquered. When he reached the lower ward, everything froze. The air seemed thicker. The sheets hung motionless, and the patients who could still open their eyes followed him with heavy gazes. He passed 3 beds, 4, and then stopped, at the bed in the corner. His. The wounded man was awake, lying there, as always, with his eyes open but expressionless. But I swear I saw. His breath faltered for half a second. He didn't blink. He didn't move a finger. But his chest hesitated. Doyle was silent for what seemed like a string of time. Then he leaned in slightly, but without touching him. He just looked and smiled. A small, sharp smile. "Looks better," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a provocation. The wounded man didn't answer. He remained still, as if he didn't recognize him, as if he were just another body on that bed. "Name?" Doyle asked, turning to me. I told him what was on the file. "Louis Marchand." He looked back at me with an expression that wasn't surprise or conviction. Just boredom. "From where?" "Saint-Laurent-sur-Saône," I replied. My tone was firm, just enough to keep from trembling. But inside me, there was a storm brewing. Doyle gave a slight nod. "Check his vitals. I want to follow up." I took the stethoscope with cold hands. I pressed it to his chest. His heart was beating too fast, like it was racing inside. But he didn't move. He didn't look at me. He just let it go. "Normal blood pressure. No fever. Stable," I declared. Doyle made a small note in a pocket notebook. Then he looked at him again and said something that still echoes in my memory like a broken whisper. "It's strange. He looks like someone I used to know, but his eyes are different." The wounded man finally turned his face. Slowly. He looked at Doyle for 2 eternal seconds and replied, "The eyes are always the first to die." Silence. Doyle smiled. This time, for real. "Indeed." He closed his notebook, turned to me, and said, "Keep up the good work. Let's stay in touch." And then he went upstairs, as if he had just confirmed something that could not be said. Agate and I stood there, motionless. And the wounded man closed his eyes. But I knew. He wasn't sleeping. He was getting ready. And I started to be sure that he wasn't just hiding. He was running from something that had already found him. Louis Marchand. The name I'd written in my own handwriting, in the blue notebook. A fiction born from my own hand, but now walking, breathing, looking at me as if it knew me better than any truth. After Doyle's visit, that name began to weigh heavily. Not like paper, but like a debt. Because every time someone uttered it, a nun, an assistant, a curious patient, something inside me creaked, as if I were shoving someone's soul into a garment that never fit. He knew it too. He never called himself by that name. He never reacted when called. Sometimes he seemed to mock it, like someone attending their own funeral and listening to a sermon about a stranger. And I, on this side, continued to weave the lie, inventing details, creating a history of symptoms that never occurred, adjusting dates, switching medication labels, disregarding norms I myself had once upheld. I began to fear myself, afraid of how easily I lied, afraid of how much that charade made me feel. Alive. Because for the first time since I'd volunteered, I wasn't just caring for a body. I was protecting a story, a presence, a mistake that made me complicit in something greater than physical pain. One morning, one of the young nurses, Elise, offered to help him eat soup. She was excited, naive, perhaps wanting to prove her worth. When she approached with the bowl, he refused. He said he had rather have the lady with the sad eyes feed him. Elise laughed, not understanding. I understood. The phrase fell on me like a heavy leaf. It wasn't affection. It was recognition. It was the confession that he knew I saw too much, felt too much. And yet, I continued. The next night, I rewrote the medical record. I tore up the previous one. I changed the spelling of the name. I changed the origin. I added false details about a supposed evacuation in Lyon, all to make it seem more real, more concrete. Because if someone were to cross-reference the information, I needed to be ready. The lie needed to resemble the truth enough to bleed. Meanwhile, he watched me, always silent. But there was something in his eyes, no longer dull but sharp, that told me, "You're no longer a nurse, you're a guardian." And perhaps that was what haunted me the most, because I no longer knew if I was doing it for him, or for myself. I found myself one random afternoon, sewing on a button on his coat, a button that wasn't even necessary, but I wanted it to look intact, as if that garment and that man could one day walk the streets and no one would notice the hole through which the truth escaped. And then I realized I was trying to clothe him in innocence, not with evidence, but with care, with gestures, with care. And that was dangerous, because when we start loving what's hidden, it's not just the world that's at risk, it's us too. We start to die a little every time someone asks, "Who is he anyway?" And the only answer I had left was a fake name. And a real fear. It was on a cold, windless morning, when the hospital seemed suspended in time, that he spoke. For the first time, not as a patient, not as a fugitive, but as a man. His voice was hoarse, almost broken, as if he were relearning how to pass through his own throat. I was changing the bandage on his shoulder, an old wound, slowly healing, when he murmured, his eyes fixed on the stained ceiling, "I didn't want it to be like this." I stopped. The tweezers slipped from my hand and clattered to the stone floor with a dull thud that echoed louder than it should have. He didn't apologize. He didn't repeat himself. He just held his gaze, as if finally saying something he'd held back for too long, and now no longer expects forgiveness. It wasn't an explanation. It wasn't a request. It was a sentence. And somehow, it cut deeper into me than any direct revelation could have. I wanted to ask, "Like what?" But the words died before they reached my lips, because there was something in his tone, a raw, aged melancholy, that said, "There's no point in digging. What's buried has already melted into the ground." In the days that followed, he talked more. Not much. Not about you, but about broken things. He mentioned cities as if they were people. "Dijon breathed through one lung," he once said. Or, "The houses of Lyon scream through their windows." These were phrases that didn't fit into diagnoses or reports. But coming from him, they sounded like maps of a soul that never found shelter again. One night, while I was preparing his medication, he asked if there was a mirror in the hospital. He said he hadn't seen himself in weeks. I said no. It was a lie. There was an antique mirror in the cabinet in the aseptic room, but I had removed it the day he arrived, because I knew. Because I feared that seeing himself would remind him of who he was, or worse, of who he had become. He didn't insist. He just nodded, as if he was already expecting the answer. The next morning, he left Clara's medallion on his pillow. He didn't say anything. He just pushed it back with his fingertips, slowly, as if returning a fragment of his own story. A small gesture, but one that sent a chill down my spine. I picked it up carefully. I opened it. The photo was faded. The crease in the center was now almost tearing the paper, but the woman's face was still there, steady, and somehow it seemed to stare at me with the same intensity. "Who was she?" I asked in a whisper. He hesitated. Then he answered quietly, "She believed in me. Until the end." That sentence struck me strangely, because the tone wasn't one of gratitude, nor pride. It was one of loss, a pain that didn't scream. It just lingered. I put the locket away, unsure of what to think. And he returned to his silence, But now there was a difference, a space, something that connected us by an invisible thread. I knew her name, and he knew I knew it, and that made us, somehow, accomplices in an absence that would never be filled. And ever since, every time the bandage needed changing, he'd look at me with those gray eyes, no longer dull, but tired. And he'd always say, "Is it going to hurt?" And I answered what he might have been asking all along, "Only if you still feel it." It was a thick October dawn, when the air seemed to hold more memories than oxygen, that something in me awakened before my senses. The hospital was asleep, or pretending to be. The lower ward was silent. The nun's footsteps had ceased hours ago, and only the boiler vibrated deep within with that continuous hiss we learned to ignore. I was sitting near the stairs, mending my apron with gray thread, when I heard a strange sound, a small but discordant sound, like a soft breath, the kind of noise only those who expect the worst notice. I got up slowly. I walked without turning on any lights, only with the ember of intuition burning in my chest. And then I saw him. He was trying to escape, bent over, trembling, his knees wobbly, and his face covered in cold sweat. He wore the same clothes he'd worn when he'd arrived, but now with pieces I'd sewn together and shoes that weren't his. He took short, hesitant steps, as if with each movement he questioned whether he really wanted to continue. His whole body said no, but something in his eyes insisted otherwise. In that moment, everything around me stopped. Time stopped moving. Sounds receded. I saw that he wasn't simply leaving. It was as if he were shedding what was left of him. A gesture that wasn't courage or cowardice. It was exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who's been hunted, of someone who's run too far without knowing what they've left behind. There was a kind of surrender in the way he staggered that hurt just to watch. Instinctively, I went after him. Without saying a word, I moved closer. He didn't react, just pressed on with more effort, as if he wanted to resist until his last muscle failed. But he didn't get far. His body gave out before he could make the decision. His legs simply gave out, and he collapsed to the ground like a breathless doll. I ran, caught him before he hit his head, and knelt with him in my arms. The heat from his body seemed to drain away. There was no strength left, just ragged breathing and the certainty that he didn't know why he had tried to leave. I carried him back to bed. Each step was an effort for me and a defeat for him. His hands were shaking and his skin was colder than ever. As I laid him down, I realized he was no longer resisting. Perhaps he didn't even know how. I didn't cry then. The tears came later, as I sat beside the bed and looked at the loose bandages, the empty space where the glass of water always stood, and the medallion he'd hidden under the pillow. I sat there until sunrise, sitting on a wooden chair, my back aching, the silence piercing my soul. When Agata walked through the door, he said nothing. He simply placed a folded blanket over the chair and left, as if understanding that certain secrets don't need to be named, only respected. That failed escape went unrecorded. Not a single line in the blue notebook mentioned what had happened. But I knew that from that early morning on, he wasn't the same. And neither was I. He never tried to leave again after that. And I stopped believing I was keeping him alive out of duty. In fact, I just wish he had one more chance to be seen before he disappeared completely. It was on a strange late afternoon, when the sky seemed lower and the air tasted of rust, that the news arrived. 2 resistance men hurried past the kitchen, grabbed a bag of supplies, and left a short message with Agata. I didn't hear the words, but I saw the way she pressed her lips together, as if swallowing a thorn. Then he beckoned me over with a discreet wave and led me to the service corridor. Her voice was low, dry, He had said a shot had been heard in the forest to the north, near the river. A body had been found, but no one knew for sure. No identification. Just rags. And blood. I returned to the ward with my heart pounding in my throat. The hospital was quieter than usual. Not even the nuns spoke to each other. It was as if everyone was waiting for something. Or someone. Entering the lower ward, I went straight to the bed in the corner. And there he was, lying down, apparently asleep. But something was different. His hand, which usually rested on his abdomen, was now clenched into a fist. His face was turned to the wall. He didn't move when I approached. He didn't move when I adjusted the sheets. I sat on the edge of the bed and stayed there for a while. The fear that ran through me was different. No longer the fear of being discovered. It was the fear of knowing, of confirming what he might have already decided. For a moment, the idea that he might have left while I slept, that he might have returned to the forest to finish what he'd started that morning, went through me like ice. I looked at the ground. There were no footprints. The clothes hadn't been disturbed. But still something didn't add up. It was then that I noticed a tiny detail. A button on the shirt was sewn with a different thread, not the one I used. A darker shade, almost black. I took the button between my fingers. It was subtle, almost invisible. But there it was. Someone had tried to mend what was no longer sewable. And I wasn't that person. Maybe he did leave. Maybe he came back before I noticed. Or maybe someone came in, left a note, a message, or just passed by as if saying goodbye in silence. Later, one of the refugee children, who was helping wash the basins, mentioned a cracking sound he'd heard coming from the forest. A dry sound that didn't sound like a tree, or thunder. And then, nothing. That night the hospital seemed to hold its breath. I couldn't sleep. I sat in front of the cafeteria window, Clara's medallion in my hands, mentally replaying everything I knew, and everything I refused to know. Doubt became a new kind of companion, more intimate than the secret itself. To this day, I don't know if that shot was his, or if it was aimed at him. There was never any confirmation. The body found was buried as an unknown. No records, no names, no lists. But sometimes, in the darkest of nights, I still wake up with the sound of that dry shot repeating in my head. And every time I hear it, I feel like it's the end. I just don't know what. Years passed. The hospital had been decommissioned long before the end of the war. Some of the nuns returned to their convents. Others disappeared into the rubble of history, without portraits, without epitaphs. Agatha died silently, as she had lived. For a time I tried to continue serving in other medical centers, until my hands no longer obeyed as before. The skin became thinner, the veins more visible, and the memory of him never faded. It only became more subtle, like a scent that lingers even after washing clothes 1,000 times. Civilian life was a kind of slow farce, a theater in which everyone pretends to have returned to normal, but still trembles at the sound of slamming doors or distant sirens. I set up a small bookstore in Lyon near the station. I lived among shelves and calendars, but within me the same shadow still lingered. That man, that room, that choice. And then, one morning in late winter, I found a manila envelope among the newspapers. No return address, no official postmark, just my name written in a handwriting I didn't recognize. I hesitated before opening it. I felt a chill run down my spine. It was as if time had held its breath. Again. Inside there was only one object. The medallion. The same crooked latch, the same rusty hinge. Clara's portrait, even more faded, now with a crack that cut the face in half, right between the eyes. There was no note, no explanation, no signature, just the cold weight of the metal, and with it, a silence that came not from the past, but from the present. I looked around. I went out into the street. No one was around. I went back inside as if something were watching me. I sat at the counter. I held the medallion between my fingers as if it were a relic or a curse. I spent hours trying to figure it out. Was it his? Had someone found it? Did anyone know? Nothing made sense. But there was a message there, one that needed no words. Maybe he had survived. Maybe he had escaped, rebuilt his life, lived for years in hiding under another name. Maybe, or maybe, someone had known him, loved him, buried him, and decided that this piece of history, this woman named Clara, needed to return to the hands that had kept her alive in secret for so long. I kept the medallion in a small box lined with blue fabric. I never opened it again, because there are objects that aren't memories. They're mirrors, and facing them again would be like crossing a still sensitive scar. I prefer mystery to certainty. I prefer silence to verdict. To this day, I don't know who sent it to me, or why. But that delivery, mute, sudden, was all I needed to understand that, even when the war ends, some stories continue. Just off the list. Time passed, and with it came wrinkles, slow gestures, the difficulty remembering where I left the simplest things. But there's one thing I've never missed. His face. Not a face with a name, but the expression it carried, that mixture of guilt and tenderness, of weariness and wounded dignity. And it's this face that visits me sometimes, when the house grows too silent or when the wind makes the shelves in my library creak like camp beds in Dijon. His name never came. He didn't appear in any post-war reports. No list of prisoners, deserters, or executed victims. I never knew if he was the wanted man, the traitor mentioned in the papers. I never knew if he was innocent, if he was charged with crimes that were never tried, or if he simply lost himself in a world that no longer knew how to forgive. I spent years searching through old newspapers, public archives, and lost news. But what I found were echoes, fragments of missing men, men no one claimed, men with no return. And it was then that I understood that perhaps he had never existed, as I had been told. Perhaps he really was what I saw lying in that damp bed, an unlisted survivor, a body caught between right and wrong, someone who had already been judged too much, and yet was treated with care by a woman who also carried her own contradictions. I never returned to the forest where they said they heard the shot. He didn't want to know which anonymous cross might have been his. I didn't go after Clara. Whether she existed, whether she still lives, I don't know. Sometimes I think Clara is me, or the part of me that could never love anyone completely, the part that learned to protect in silence, even without understanding what it was protecting. Today, in this loft that looks more like an abandoned bookstore, I look around and see shelves full of names, authors, characters, dates, all catalogued, labeled, recognizable. But him? No. He remains in limbo. No epigraph, no epitaph. Just a memory that sometimes pulsates stronger than my own name. I never knew if I saved a guilty person. I never knew if I regretted it. But I know that for a while, he breathed because of my hands. And perhaps in the end that is all I can offer. The memory of someone no one else recognized, but who, for a brief moment, was kept alive by someone who also wanted to be seen. These days, almost everything escapes me. The names of my neighbors, the dates of the seasons, the reason I entered a room. But some things remain. Things that don't make a sound, that don't have a signed document, that don't appear in the records. but live here inside as if sewn into my flesh. He was one of those things. I don't know why I did what I did. I was never sure if it was pity or identification. I only know that hiding him, caring for him, protecting him from what was out there, and perhaps from what was in himself, was also a way of protecting myself, of saving a part of me that still believed no one deserves to die without a human touch, without a last look that says, "I see you, even if you don't want to be seen." There are days when I open the blue fabric box, the one where I kept the medallion, not to see it again, but to feel its weight. It still amazes me how something so small can carry so much silence. Sometimes I think that if I showed this medallion to anyone, no one would understand. It would just be an old, worthless object. But for me, it still burns. It still speaks. It still bleeds. Some say some stories need endings. I don't believe that anymore. Some stories don't end. They just retreat. They hide in the corridors of time, waiting for someone one day to hear them with an open heart. Maybe this story you just heard never had a clear beginning, nor a neat ending, but it existed. It breathes within me. And maybe, if it touched something within you, now it breathes within you too. If this story has found any wounds in you, maybe we are healing together, even without knowing it. Comment here, or just listen. That's enough.